Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of sketchyGOichie. I am your host, Roger Andrews, and on this video we are going to delve into hands. I did a whole video, an epic one by my standards, on the subject of hands. It is a bugaboo, a crucible, if you will, for a lot of artists rendering hands. I figured out a way to make it simpler, I think, and faster and easier for you to render. Hopefully this is pretty straightforward and clear cut. It's epic in that it took me about an hour of actual video time, somewhere in that range. We'll see once it gets edited out, to express my way of handling hands. And it's a way I think for beginning artists, it's a great way to start. It's no substitute for real hand study, but I think my process may be a way for you guys to kind of at least have a sense and understanding on how to render hands and how to make them look, have the right emotion in the hands when you render them, or at least the right tension or whatever. You'll see with the with the video as I put it together. So anyways, jump right in, enjoy the video, leave a comment, post them on my Facebook page, my sketchyGOichie Facebook page, and enjoy. All right, sketchyGOichie, live your moment. Peace. All right, let's get into this. Step one in what is hopefully an easy and fast process to rendering hands. See what I just did there? Yes, step one, the reference. Gots to have reference. And let's face it, the fact is, if you're fortunate to have two good hands, you know, if you render with your left hand, the right hand is great reference. If you render with the right, the opposite is true. And so simply what I did is I grabbed a hold of the old iPhone and sat out in the hallway right next to my closet and just snapped a few pictures with the iPhone of my hand in various positions, kind of the most commonly used positions you would see hand renders in, and literally just took some pictures. I mean, you've got reference literally right there with you everywhere you go. You know, again, if you're fortunate to have two good hands. So what I did is, or should I say, what I'm doing now is I'm taking those collection of images, I'm bringing them into Procreate. Let me give you the full specs. So Procreate, latest version, I think it's 4.3 on my iPad, 12.9 inch screen, iPad Pro, first gen actually, so I got an old school one, but it works great, so no need for me to upgrade, not yet anyways. And yeah, just Procreate app, iPad Pro, Apple Pencil also. And all I'm doing is launch the app, and you just simply go on into that little sort of wrench icon. See, click insert a photo. It will go right to your camera roll right there in your iPad. I have the iCloud, so it's anything taken on the iPhone is immediately up in the iCloud and available for me to pull down on the iPad. And yeah, so individually I'm just selecting the poses I like best, composing them on the page there. And now I'm going to take them. You notice they're all in individual layers. I'm going to pinch them all together to make one layer. The reason I do that is I don't need them as individual layers. I want to be able to manipulate them all as one. I add a new layer on top. That's what layer 2 is. And I go back to layer 1, which contains all of the hand poses, and just move the slider down, the opacity slider down a bit. Once I've done that, I make sure I select the layer and then I want to render on. All right, so that brings me to step 2, right into it, the actual drawing part of it. Okay, so as you guys have just seen, I've taken my ready-made reference, my hands, taken photos, brought them in. So now let me go into that document, and using my trusty Apple Pencil, I am going to make sure that absolutely certain that the rendering I do is on layer 2. So layer 1, I'm just kind of, I just wanted to see that, there's the photos, right? There's the hand in sort of the standard, laid out flat, all 5 fingers out. There's sort of a kind of a clutching pose. There's sort of a hand gesture, sort of outward, fingers outstretched. There's your fist, which also could be used as a grasping, like if you're grasping a tool, like a hammer or something. There's another gesture pose from the top view. Here's one sort of, there's your fist, your punching fist, and your thumbs up, just an affirmative. All right. Again, there's your slider, right? There's the little N within the layer box, and you just slide that sucker down and watch the opacity slide. That N represents normal. That's what the N, if you're wondering why it says N there. That's the mode it's in. It's the layer giving you an indication of which mode you're in. You have several modes, including, multiply and screen and all that other stuff. We can get into that at another time. So now that I've reduced the opacity, and I'm definitely making sure I'm on a layer on top, this is me just showing you the basics of the hand. So whenever you're rendering the hand, obviously there's that sort of palm, that centralmost palm section, and then the fingers, as you can see, are segmented, and they come, obviously they come out of that central palm, sort of trapezoid shape. I'm just rendering these as boxes for now. Obviously, when you render hands and you're learning to draw hands, those boxes could be rendered in the form of cylinders, so that you have the volume. And there's this little pad that comes off of the main palm that represents the thumb, and then the thumb has, I've indicated it in 2 segments here, but it's actually 3 segments. There's a little baby nub of bone there at the end of the thumb, and then there's the point where the wrist meets the hand there, and that's that. To be honest with you, that's your hand. Guys, I mean, literally, that is the simplicity. I know, as indicated by those several images of my hand, all the different myriad of positions that a human hand can take. I get it, and it seems complicated. I know, but it really is that central shape and those segmented fingers off of it. Now, here's where you get into the fun of drawing hands, for me, anyways. It's once you kind of have a sense of what the hand is doing, where the muscle and the tissue on top forms over the bones, you can kind of just sort of do a gestural sketch of the hands based on what's happening with the anatomy. Now, of course, there is no substitute for actually knowing the human anatomy of a hand. If you really want to study a hand, you can, obviously you can take classes. Again, you can render from those mitts that you that you have at the end of your arm, and you can definitely sort of get a better grasp and detailed understanding of the anatomy and what makes a hand work. Okay? Again, but for me, I simplify a hand in this manner, so that way I essentially have the building blocks of making a hand look realistic, even though this is just a simple, sketchy line art drawing, right? You're gonna see in a few seconds. I'm gonna remove the layer that has. So there you go. I'm gonna take away the layer, and there's the hand. Again, I'm certainly not tooting my own horn. This is a really quick gesture sketch, but I think it gets the feel and the flavor of the hand. It even has a little bit of the sort of, I'm calling it emotion. I mean, it's not really emotion. It's just sort of the gesture that comes with the human hand. And so that way, once you get comfortable with that, here, I'm gonna try another one in a different color. By the way, I'm just rendering these in different colors just so they distinguish themselves from the background, or should I say the art. So here's where I'm gonna indicate the bones. Again, this is not a detailed study in anatomy, but I just wanted to give you a rough sense of what's going on underneath. All right, so obviously, again, it's the 3 segmented bones for each of the fingers on the hand, right? There's again 3 on each, even the thumb, even the thumb's got kind of it opposes these main digits in that come off the main fingers. But again, essentially it's the 3. This is what's going on underneath the flesh and underneath the muscle. All right, and that's sort of the joint where it goes into Again, I haven't indicated it there, but there is a third little bone that leads out to the tip of the thumb. Here's where I'm indicating the long bones that run through the hand, the ones that connect to the wrist. Again, not super anatomical, guys, but it's just meant to kind of give you an indication of what's going on underneath. And there's like a collection of little bones there, right where the wrist meets the forearm bones. There's a, I just kind of did one mass shape, but the reality is there's a collection of little bones. That's what allows all that flexibility in the hand. Obviously the muscle and the cartilage and everything is doing the work, but the bone structure, that's just the basic essence of the bone structure in the simplest form I can render. Okay, so let's take that away, and let's get back to just sort of rendering these hands in the simplest way possible. And really what we're going to focus on is the identifying features that kind of that trick the eye in line art, that trick the eye into thinking there are folds, into thinking there are creases. There's ways of rendering the line, again, because I'm kind of a line art artist, that's the way I'll show you. And that kind of, it's, all right, so this is a good example. All right, I'm gonna give you a little simple, kind of form of the hand. All right, just if I kind of trace over the outer shape of the hand, right? Even in this sort of rough shape, you notice there on the pinky, I kind of, or actually that's a good example. Right there on the thumb, the way I'm edging the line, the way I'm sort of finding the, see, all right, add the thumbnail is a great way of indicating finger as well, right? But notice how quickly you can render a hand if you kind of have a sense of, the anatomy underneath. Obviously, that's the most helpful, but following the reference, seeing where the bends are, All right, let me zoom in a bit here. The thumb is, again, the best example. You can see where the bend is, where the pad of the thumb leading towards where the thumbnail is. And those little indicators, you see those little lines, they're like 2 or 3 lines on the segments of each finger, particularly the one I just rendered on the thumb. That sort of that little line for some reason tricks the eye into giving you the impression that there's depth. All right, so here's a better example. This is that really clutching gesture fingers in this hand, this second hand. All right, notice how, like, when I'm rendering these, notice where I stop the line, right there again. See how that crease is kind of indicated? You notice how I don't render that line all the way over, all the way to the edge of the outer edge of the top of the finger? You notice how it kind of stops. And just in that gesture, that little nub right there, actually on that pinky finger on that hand, that just above the thumbnail, that fingernail, that pinky nail, that little line right there kind of gives you the impression that there is volume. I don't know why that is. I don't know who discovered it all those centuries ago. Right there, that little line. Let me do it a little better. Right there. Doesn't that kind of, hopefully you guys can see it. It kind of gives you the impression that finger has some depth. It's just one little line. It's something I kind of picked up years ago when I started rendering hands and started rendering them accurately. Just that little line. See that? Just those little areas where the crease is, the little area on the palm that kind of represents those little those lines in the palm. I don't overly render those, by the way, whenever I'm rendering hands. I never over render, like if you have an open palm, I don't render all of the sort of lifelines. I think it's unless, obviously I'm doing a super realistic hand and it's going to be sort of painterly, I would. Here's another little trick too, right here on the thumb. When the thumb is sort of foreshortened, where it's coming at you, a lot happens with the fingers when they're coming at you. The tips, the pad, the sort of the very tip of the fingers, they sort of head upwards. If you render them, particularly right there with the thumb, where it looks like it's it's going upwards, like that, where it's like where you see the tip, the sort of, again, the pad of the thumb and fingers, it gives you the impression that it is coming at you, that it has dimension. It's a little trick. And again, here's the thing. Notice how, like, I'm not rendering the fingers straight. They're having their little angled curves, right? I hope you guys are picking up on that. They're not perfect cylinders. Even someone, like if you look at sort of how to render, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, how to draw the Marvel comic books way, or I believe that's what the title is, I should know. I mean, I read the book like a dozen times in the 80s, and probably like 10 dozen since. But yeah, where you're rendering hands and they're like cylinders, they're a series of cylinders for the fingers. Even then, once you render the cylinders, once you're drawing on top of that, you have to take into account how the knuckles go and how the bottom of the fingers, sort of the pads at the bottom of the fingers, sort of curve inwards. Same thing with a fist. When you have a clenched fist, what happens generally in that position, the position I have this one drawn in, you notice these little curves at the top. That represents, see that, and where the crease is. That represents that visual representation of the sort of that knuckle that we're actually able to see. And that knuckle is probably at that point the topmost knuckle. You know, if it's knuckle 1, 2, it's 1 and 2 on the finger. Third one, if you include the one that's actually on the hand, that would be, I guess, would be the first knuckle after the one that's that main one, the one that's actually on the hand that connects the fingers. That's what that represents, because knuckle 2 and 3 are folded up into the palm, right? And the way to indicate that is right there. You see that little line, the way it stops, and then I draw the line on its own, and then the next line, the next segment, and that line right there. That's what's going to trick the eye into thinking you have volume there, right? And then again, another thing I don't over-render is that sort of fleshy part where the thumb sort of comes off the palm. That thing, there's a severe curve there. You can see it right there in the center of the palm, just to kind of indicate that curves back towards the thumb. You definitely want to indicate that, but don't overly render that, and don't give it too much depth. And there's little areas where, right there, those lines, those are so important to indicating depth, to giving the impression that those fingers that are tucked in are heading down into the palm, you know, and it gives that energy, it gives that sense of it, all right? So quickly, all right, these, by the way, these are real time, as you can tell, and there's nothing slowed down or sped up. So you can see how quickly you can kind of go through these photographs and sort of literally trace on top. Right there is that, I mean, to me, that's the essence of making a hand look kind of realistic, is those little sort of creases in the thumb, those little creases where the thumb, right there, where the thumb sort of meets the palm. Those are so helpful in sort of selling the idea that you're rendering the human hand. All right? Again, I want you guys to note the technique. It's sort of just short lines up right there where it creases in. See? Where the hand is literally pressed, that tip of that forefinger is pressed into the flesh of the palm. And it's so vital to show that. There's that little line. There's where I indicate the fingernail on that particular finger. That little line right there is crucial. The one where you can, see right there, that little line, that guy right there. Those are crucial. It tricks you into it gives you the impression that finger is bent. Just that little line, it stops. It doesn't meet the edge of the line, right? Right there, see, it stops, right? There's the indication where, you know, those lines right there, that's the indication where the segments of the finger, you know, the ones that are leading into the palm, right? Again, little lines to represent that little pad, that little fleshy pad that leads from the thumb off of the, right there. There's another good indication too. There's another thing to note. See right there. See where that line, it extends down into the wrist, past where the wrist meets the hand, and then the line from where the wrist continues on down to the forearm, right? If you give it that, it kind of looks like it overlaps just by extending that line down. Gives the impression, gives the view of the eye, the impression by eye that it is, even though it's not reality, it's literally just lines on a page, gives you the impression that it extends past the wrist, right? All right, so there's a thumbs up. Hopefully you guys get a thumbs up and you're getting what I'm trying to put down here. All right, the top of the knuckle too, that main knuckle, that knuckle that attaches, that's hugely important. All right, there's that another example where it just kind of overlaps just a little bit, and then I continue down. See, overlap, and continue down. I don't connect those lines right there. Again, that's another way to give the impression of depth. Is all the lines don't have to connect, guys. Maybe, obviously if you're going to render in color afterwards, and you probably want all the outer lines to connect, so that way it's easy to kind of put this all the line on a reference layer, and then and then render. I'm going to do that later on. It's great if all the lines connect, but the reality is, let's face it, little straight line there. The reality is, if you're able to kind of see the illustration, and particularly if you're rendering line, and see the areas of shadow, right, and then see where the shadow falls off, and then stop your line where the shadow falls off, like right there. There's no reason for me to extend that line all the way out to the edge of the hand. I'm erasing this little section here because I notice it kind of doesn't represent that. See that little curve? It sells it a little more. It sells the tension of the fist. That sort of that punching motion. It sells it more if it's not a straight line from that top of the knuckle all the way back to where the thumb meets the hand. Again, there's those little indicators, those little lines that suggest curvature, or suggest that that the knuckle, where the knuckle is. And it's usually, for me, it's no more than 2 or 3 little lines, depending on the knuckle. I guess if you're drawing an older hand and it's got a bit more wrinkles in it, or I would draw, in this case, if it was a female hand or a child's hand, I would draw less pronounced knuckle indication or indicators. I would draw it less. Oh, right there I created a new layer for this particular hand. I noticed it was kind of coming close to that fist, and so I knew I was going to have to move it at some point, so I just created a new layer and just kept the same brush. Oh, by the way, brush, this is what I'm using for this, kind of my go-to brush. Again, it's in the base set. It's the Technical Pen in your inking brush palette. All right, so it's just Technical Pen, and I've made some alterations to it to kind of give it a little bit more flavor, the flavor that I like. As you can see, speaking of flavor, as you can see, on this hand, what I like is it's going back into depth, and there's where line weight pays dividends, right? You notice that the forefinger, the pointer finger, how it's actually the smallest finger in this particular hand drawing. Notice also how the thumb sort of kind of gets smaller as it goes back into depth. That's hugely important to capture in hands, particularly hands that are not in just a standard straight-on point of view. All right, hugely important is to the fingers that are off in the distance get smaller, and particularly the further they are away from the viewer, further, away from the camera, as I like to say. All right, and if you can be comfortable in rendering these hands in different positions, challenge yourself. Maybe start initially with a basic hand pose, which is ultimately what I started with in this one. That sort of that hand with 5 fingers outstretched. Perhaps that's the way to start, just to get a feel for where to start and stop your line. Just to get a feel for it, and then challenge yourself. Do these hands in these odd positions, because let's face it, these are the positions you're going to have to render constantly. All right, see, here's me just indicating those little the points where the fingers fold. Particularly when your palms are facing up. Those little, and it's usually 1 or 2 lines that kind of represent that. And if you look down at your own hand, just notice that there are those those little folds where it allows the finger to clutch, the fingers to clutch things. Here, it's another funny thing. I don't know if I've done it in all. I'd have to go back and review. But sometimes I start with a fingernail. It's a crazy thing. I don't know that I would recommend it. But sometimes I start with doing it again here. I think it's because I want to leave that space at the top for the point in the finger where it's just above the fingernail. I want to leave a little space for that, because otherwise it's tough to tell the fingernail. And also, here's a great one to kind of note too. I put that little arrow there to note the webbing, that little bit of webbing that we all have in between fingers, right? And then there's that little crease. That's showing that little line there where it stops and ends is showing that that little topmost part of that finger that is bent right? That's how I'm able to kind of trick the eye, trick the viewer into thinking, oh wow, that finger is bent and it's going off into space. Well, not lost in space, but it's going off into dimension, I should say. Not dimensions either. Anyways, it's got depth. That's the bottom line. All right. So that's my way of indicating that. Again, there's the point where the thumb meets. There's that. Notice that little line, that little thin line that I did along the edge there, where the thumb is towards the bottom. It's just indicating where that. I guess that's probably like, it's a little bit of bone and cartilage right there. And there's a knuckle too. That's the thing. When you're on the opposite of the palm, you're on the face of the hand. There's a little indicator there to show where that knuckle is in each. And I don't over render it. I usually do. I usually try not to indicate. It's funny. It's a weird thing, but I try not to indicate that fourth knuckle, the pinky knuckle, that little line. For some reason, when I add that one in, it flattens the hand. By that I mean it looks flatter. It looks less dimensional, less three-dimensional. As three-dimensional as you can get. Here's me just anal retentively kind of shifting the fingers around because I think they looked a little funky. They were overlapping each other in an odd way that I didn't like. I have this strange thing. I like to compose these things on a page so that at least it looks pleasing to me, and hopefully by proxy pleasing for you to look at. All right, so here's the stage where I'm just sort of, again, just shifting them, moving them around a little bit. I think what I'm doing there is eliminating that. I thought that hand looked a little odd, that first hand I rendered on that color. And I thought the one that I rendered in blue was a little more in line with the other ones. So what I'm doing is I just copied it, and I think I cut it and pasted it onto its own layer. I'm just kind of cleaning it up so it kind of matches the other ones on the page. And I'm going to go into right there, hue saturation, and I'm going to play around with the sliders so that color of, it's sort of like a purpley color, it matches the other purple hands on the page. Again, doesn't necessarily have to happen, especially if let's face it, these are just practice hands. But because I'm sharing it with you guys, I guess I felt pressure to make sure it looked decent, at least for you guys. All right, so moving around the page, there's our hand number one, as you can see. I'm gonna join it with its fellow hands on the page, right? I'm gonna pinch them all together so that if I want to make alterations or changes, that all those hands will be all on the same layer, right? I'm gonna go through the process now, kind of closing off the gaps. The reason I want to close off the gaps is because if I want to apply color to these down the road, or shading or whatever, I want to be able to turn this line art layer into a reference layer, which will therefore allow me to literally just fill in blocks of color on another layer. If the reference layer, basically it references the line art and uses it as a guide in order to fill. I've used the term in previous videos, paint bucket, because it's what I would use in Photoshop, but in Procreate, you grab that little, you see that little sort of pinkish color circle in the very upper right hand corner of the screen. You literally can drag it in, and you'll see that a little bit later in the video. I'll show you how to do it. Yeah, so this is just me kind of going around each finger and each hand and making sure they're closed. The line art is closed, meaning there are no open gaps. So that way, when I go to fill the color, it'll just go inside the hand and not throughout the entire canvas area, right? So this is me just trying to, just seeing areas, because again, I rendered it so quickly and so loosely that there are going to be areas where the line doesn't meet, right? Like that, for example. Let me zoom in. You can see it where the line doesn't meet. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think I had to go back in, and I think this one or this hand, one of these hands was tricky. I was missing one little minor spot that wasn't fully closed, which allowed me, whenever I grabbed the old the fill color, when I was trying to fill it, it would fill the entire canvas. And I knew I was off somewhere, right? So whereas this hand is it's a little rougher than the other ones, but at this stage it doesn't matter. I just want you guys to note the proportions, right? Again, these are quick renders using my own hand as reference, but hopefully you can note that these all look like real hands. And I know so many people, I've gotten so many comments on both the sketchyGOichie Facebook page and also on this YouTube channel about hands, requests for, how do you render hands. Oh, here's the example. All right, I want to show you that one hand, the clutched hand. Clearly there's some open spaces somewhere in that hand, right? So I made a reference layer out of that hand and tried to fill, and there's something hinky. There's some area where clearly where it's not fully enclosed, this hand. I think it's the most dramatic of the hands, if that's worth anything. Look at, still not closed. So something somewhere in here I have to zoom in and make absolutely certain. Could be that corner, could be this edge here, could be in here along one of these fingers. Oh, that might have been it. Maybe it's that one. Who knows? I think it's the one right there on the top. And all it takes is that little bit of, area where the line doesn't fully connect to cause trouble. All right. Finally found it. So, but what's cool about this is essentially I basically created a mask out of that. And the irony is I kind of discovered that I created a mask out of that layer. It's a reference layer, so it's only filling in. It's underneath the reference layer, so it's only filling in the area that is not the hand, or the hands, I should say plural, because there are many on the page, right? It's only filling in that area, all right? So if I were to, to blank that particular, or should I say, make it so you can't view that layer, you'll notice that it's, oh, you know what I think I just realized here? I just realized I inadvertently filled in those spaces between those fingers on that clutch hand. I inadvertently filled that on the actual line art layer. Did not want to do that. I want that to be on the layer underneath. So don't make that mistake. Make sure you're on the layer underneath the reference layer, the line art layer. See, now I think I've corrected the problem. But anyways, so I didn't realize I was doing it, and maybe this is how other artists work, but I basically created a mask. Oftentimes I will, maybe it's not the best way to do it, but for something quick and dirty and fast like this, well, it's not that dirty, it's fairly clean, but something like this, I think it works, just creating that layer underneath of color. And, obviously I can select the line and with the hue and saturation, and I can sort of play around with the darkness and the, I can certainly play around with the saturation of it. I can change the line color. Because I rendered the line in a color, it's very easy to do. It's a little more difficult if you render the line in black. But because I rendered it in color, I can certainly desaturate it and make it black. I can literally take that center slider, the one that says saturation. I can scoot that all the way over to the left, and that would take all the color out or desaturate it. And I can move that slider over, because it's just the line art, I can move that brightness slider all the way over to the left, and it'll turn it to pure black. So that's doable. And you can go the opposite direction to create, like pure white, which is a great little tool, by the way. That's a tremendous trick. By scooting that slider all the way to the right, the brightness one, and turning a line into white. So basically you can basically knock out your line from black to white. It's a nice little tidbit, unexpected tidbit in a hand drawing in Procreate thing. So, all right, here's another good trick too. Guys, don't be afraid to duplicate your layers. So at some point down the road, I may want to do that background in a different color. So I just duplicate that background layer, that color layer. And this is me just sort of like going into brightness, the hue, saturation, brightness, palette, and just literally I can change it at will. But it's its own layer because I duplicated it. I have the original layer to use. And same thing with the line art. Why not duplicate the line art? And what I did there is I filled that line art with black. Just so I have the variation of black, if I want to use it as pure black, so you can see it really clearly on the background. And then I just took the opacity and slid down the opacity a little bit, so it's picking up some of the purple. Anyways, so that's the hands, tension. Guys, give me the thumbs up. Hopefully, bear with me. I'm going into the final stage of this project, but that's hands. Simple, easy, use reference, use your own hands as reference. Go on Google for reference. All right, moving on. Step 3, final stage of this, rendering. Now, this is where you can have the most fun. For me, the line art is the most fun. I like drawing in line art. That's kind of like a comic book trained guy. I really enjoy it. I like to try to get as much action and adventure as I can in the line, and then apply color or shading to it on top. But so others can get all that action, drama, adventure just by moving paint around, on whether it be on the screen or on a canvas. Again, much respect. I've said it in previous videos. I love people in all the different styles, and there's no particular right way to do it. There are some wrong ways to do it. I'm not gonna go into those, but there is no wrong way to achieve what in everything that I'm doing. You can certainly do with, by just painting, literally filling in shapes and finding the volume and finding all that depth and everything with painting. You can definitely do that. This is just me zooming in on that particular line art. I decided to go blue. For some reason, the purple wasn't suiting me for whatever reason. But so I just shifting the line to a deep blue, and then I'm shifting the background to this kind of pale blue. So that's not taking any of the shine away from the hands themselves. And then I thought it might be kind of cool to kind of just do a little quick flat kind of cell shading on each of these hands, the rendering stage. Again, this is the part that is the most open for interpretation as an artist, whatever style suits you. If you like to kind of render in a real soft brush, if you like to render with a textured brush, I like cell style animation, and I like hand rendered cell animation. I like anime, and I like that feel of a hard shadow and a hard highlight with a mid-tone. I love that. And you'll see that in almost all of the videos that I do. It's just it's what I gravitate when I'm looking at other artists' work. And it's what I gravitate when I'm rendering my own stuff. This is me discovering the fact that I basically created a mask out of that color layer, that color background layer. So I basically just put a layer underneath the color background layer and filled it with a color. That's what that blue is, those hands. So those are masked out blue hands. I can change that color at will, that whole layer. I could just literally go into that hue, saturation, and brightness palette and change that at will. And this is me now. I picked a really deep blue with lots of black in it. And because it's masked, this is the fun part, because it's masked, as long as I'm underneath that layer, that color layer that I created initially and then duplicated and changed the color on, it's basically masking out the shadow that I'm rendering in. It's again, this could be something. I don't know why it's a eureka moment for me. It's probably something that people have been doing forever with this app. Customarily, I would go in, I would render, I would take that little sort of that S-shaped tool on the upper left-hand top of the toolbar there. If you're at the corner of this page, you see where it says Gallery. There's a little wrench, and there's a little magic wand, and there's a little S-shaped thing, kind of a selection tool. I think that's what the S stands for. Heck, it kind of acts as the lasso tool for those who are familiar with Photoshop toolbars or toolboxes. And then the last one there is the direct selection tool, but that one, not even really a selection tool so much as it's the ability to manipulate things. It allows you to, it takes you to a place where you can warp things and you can distort them and you can move. It's a move tool, actually. It's probably that last little arrow. But anyway, so that generally I would use that select one, the S, the lasso, and I would draw essentially a outline around each individual hand. I'd make sure I close it and then move on to the next hand, and I would go in and out of each finger and all the way around. And then once I've drawn a selection around all of the hands on the page, I would open a new layer, and then I would basically fill that selection with any color. It could be white, it could be white. I usually do white for some reason, but I would fill that color, and now the hands are their own selection, which is probably a little wiser. Particularly if I want to fill in and do different effects and everything, you want that hand to be its own thing. But now that I've kind of rendered it with this quick fast, with that sort of mask that was created by the color, I'm thinking there may be some opportunities there to explore. There may be some ways to essentially, the one thing that the advantage that Photoshop has is the ability to cut selections and to manipulate them in that fashion. I think it'll probably come in future versions. Maybe a more advanced way of selecting things with sort of like a sort of magic wand in a sense, basically the way that Photoshop does it. I think hopefully they'll bring that feature, that functionality to this at some point, because that would be a huge time saver in terms of workflow. Anyways, back to the drawing, the rendering. So this is the I'm just, again, light source, finding in this sort of clutched hands, this grasp hand, the tricky one, the one who's giving me the most trouble. Just lit from below, coming up. So obviously the most shadowed areas would be away from the light. I thought that hand has the most drama, so I thought it should have the most dramatic lighting. I chose that similar light source on this one. You can see it's less dramatic on this hand that sort of got a more relaxed gesture to it. But it is just applying shading to the area that is what you perceive as being away from the light. Right? That's all there is to it, guys. That's, if we make it any more complicated than that, then we're doing too much. You can, through time and study and practice, develop a real keen eye for rendering things to taking into account light sourcing and can lighting and backfills and all the different ways of making things look really photorealistic. Changing the coolness and the warmness of the shadows and the highlights, and you can get into all of that. And trust me, there are some, I've said this like probably in just about every video where I reference other artists on YouTube, but there are literally a mountain of, not a mountain, maybe a molehill of other artists who can give you real in-depth training on how to render things in a more painterly style. There are even some great artists who can do this in a more cartoony style and in whatever way appeals to you. But for me, simple, clean. Shadow is coming from a place where the light is away from where the light is the most intense. So obviously the most shadowy areas are would be where there is an absence of light. That's really all there is to it. And that is some of it is feel, believe it or not. I mean, some of it is just like, obviously if we render enough, you take the physics out of it, because the reality is it's just where light bends and where light meets areas, and how some areas are they sort of kind of like the palm there would go around the backside of the hand, where the rightmost part of this particular hand I'm on right now, it's not going to see any light. The backside of that hand, most of that big mass of shadow really wouldn't see any of the light, because the light is really there on the left side. And a lot of that is feel. A lot of that is, even some of the rendering where this is where I say the feel comes into play. The rendering where that middle between the two topmost fingers, that space in between, there probably would be some shadow that's created by that forefinger leading to the middle finger. You might not even see much light in there, and maybe not much light on that third finger heading towards the pinky. That's just the way it goes. Sometimes it's feel, sometimes it's like, this is still art. And, if you want to be photorealistic, obviously you would have the photo in front of you, and you would be really trying to accurately capture all the planes of shadow and all the areas of light and all that. But for me, it's just, I kind of hit it, get in there, hit it, get out. Same thing here. I know, obviously that chunky area of flesh where the palm is, obviously that would cast, that would have a deep shadow, because it's got a deep depth to it. So it's necessary for that to have it. You know, and the fingers less so, particularly the one, you know, that's heading off, you know, I said into space earlier, that's, you know, it's heading back into perspective, so it you know, doesn't need as much, but it does need that little shadow to give it depth, where it separates from the other three fingers, which is another good point for hands, guys. You're gonna notice there's a trick when you extend your hand outward. Generally, the pinky and the forefinger, the pointer finger, flare out. The two center fingers almost always stay together. I don't know why that is. Sometimes, you know, if you're doing more of a pointing gesture, that pinky will tuck in with the other three fingers and allow the thumb and the forefinger to be separate and open. But when you're doing hand gestures, I like to have it so almost like, you know, of the four fingers, you know, that pointer finger is separate. It's almost like it's, you know, it's an orphan. It needs a home. But the other kids in the orphanage they're on their own. You know, it's the new kid at school. It's for some reason it's almost always separate. And you can create the best gestures if that forefinger is just a little bit separate from the other three. And, you know, obviously it's closest to the thumb, but, you know, the thumb is opposing, so it's facing off in its own direction too. So, you know, maybe they're always doing their own thing. So when you're rendering a hand, you know, be thoughtful of that. You know, I like to use the term mindful. But yeah, be mindful of that. It's something that really sells a hand gesture. As you can see here, I'm kind of closing up shop on the shadow layer. You know, at some point I will start doing a little highlight layer. The highlight layer, I'll use pure white for the highlight layer. It occurs to me now, if I really wanted to, I could introduce a little bit of color into the white to be able to have the ability to go into the hue, saturation, and brightness, and kind of add and, you know, increase and decrease the light. But anyways, this is just me kind of like looking at the overall layout of them. I'm deciding right now if I want to change the shadow but I'm like, you know what, whatever. They are what they are. By changing the shadow, I mean like change the light source on any of them, so, you know, just so it felt a little more natural. But I didn't think it was necessary. I think they fit okay on the page. All right, so I'm just kind of determining. All right, so am I gonna start with? So right here's me selecting white, creating a new layer. You know, I need to make sure that layer is underneath. Again, underneath that sort of that newly created masked layer. And then again, the highlight the highlight doesn't have to encompass the entire, in this case, left side. The reality is probably wouldn't be that intense. It wouldn't be too intense because the light is really around the corner. It's on the other side of the hand. So there's really no need for the highlights to be super intense. And I think a lot of problem artists have is they over highlight things. The highlight here is really intense right now because it's pure white, but I know I'm going to go in and reduce the opacity of the white at some point in the process down the road. So that's why I am not so worried or concerned about the harshness of the white. Fact is, I'm not really concerned about much, especially as it relates to working in Procreate. Let's face it, the fact that I'm working digitally is it's so freeing in so many ways, and especially at the sketch stage. There's a level of freedom that comes from knowing that there are unlimited undos, and I can lay down a line and it's not quite right, and I just two-finger tap and that line disappears, and I lay down another one, that one's not right, two-finger tap, make it disappear. Same thing, you can see that all happening here with this white. When I did this sort of rendering stage, this shadow and highlight, I think, and hopefully you can kind of tell it's done in a really rough manner, really kind of rudimentary. Right there, there's an undo, like a little two-finger tap for an undo. But and the point is, it's just to get the highlight and the shadow, and I wasn't looking for it to be really precise. The fact that I even went back there on that first hand and added a little more highlight along that left side of that hand is, you know, almost doing too much at that point. It's just, I don't know, it's probably a pride thing. I want it to kind of look a little nice, even though this is extraordinarily rough, at least by my standards. So that would be something I would want to share with you guys. Just, you know, if you're working digitally, whether it be Procreate or any other one of these these apps, it's, you know, the undo process should free you up to really be super creative. If anything, you know, it's not a crutch to work digitally. It should just be a creative stepladder rather than it being a creative crutch. And the fact is, and I've said this 1,000 times, because oftentimes I'll do live presentations, and I will, you know, I'll say I'll work in Procreate and I'll talk about my process, and I will emphasize to anyone who's listening that the reality is it is not the app that does the work, it's the artist that does the work. And so even though I'm doing these super loose and gestural in some ways, it's not the pen I selected that makes the line. It's not you know, the particular shade of white or blue or whatever that makes the rendering. It's the artist. It's the artist's choice, and it's the amount of time and effort you want to put into making this stuff look great. And so that's really the focus. That's, you know, when I talk about sketchyGOichie, I mention it in my sign off, and in this case in my intro, and I say live your moment. What I mean by that, for those who are you know, uninitiated, is in effect, if you're rendering something, you're drawing something, painting something, enjoy it. You know, don't be so focused on other things. Kind of like dial in on what you're working on, because the fact is that if you derive any kind of joy from drawing or painting or anything art related, it could be, you know, playing guitar or sculpting or whatever you do that's artistic, or writing, and if you're not enjoying the process of it, you're not living in your moment. You're not maximizing your creativity, in my opinion. I think that's when you become the most creative, when you're unburdened by the other aspects of life and you're not focused on other things. You're focused on the drawing at hand, in my case. And I got to be honest with you, there's a sort of a autopilot. You know, it's almost like a possession that happens if you're in the mix of something, a particular piece that's really just firing on all cylinders, and you're autopilot. You just go. And so that's what I mean when I say sketchyGOichie. I mean just live your moment. Speaking of living your moment, here's me sort of I think at this point I decided to kind of fine tune. You know, I'm playing with the opacity of the white highlight. See, here's where I select that white highlight layer and dial it down. I don't know, 60%, 62%, whatever it wound up at, and I want it to be less intense. And then here's me playing around with the shadow. I was like, the highlight and the shadow, to try to figure out, all right, how do I best sort of make this work? You know, right now to me they feel a little dark. They feel a little, you know, here's me kind of really playing with the slider. Now they feel a little extra dark right now. The intensity that I was going for wasn't really coming off. The reality is they were becoming a little tough to read from a distance. That's really, you know, probably because when I did the rendering, I did it so simply, like literally that one hard shadow and that one hard highlight. And that's probably why, you know, it's a little tricky to, you know, as you zoom in, you can kind of see them pretty well as you zoom in, but as you zoom out, you lose them a little bit. It's probably because it's blue on blue on blue with white. So there's not a lot of, you know, not a lot of play, not a lot for your eye to really focus on. But there's a point in time here where I think I just threw a screen on one of the layers, and then boom, I got this effect. And all it did is it basically stripped away all the blue and kind of left this kind of white and gray. And that is what made that. So hands, made simply. Practice, use yourself for reference, and that is how you do it. Signing off, sketchyGOichie, live your moment. Happy sketching, y'all. Peace.